AP Environmental Science is going to start out with Chapter 1, of course, and going to really talk about some current environmental problems, some causes of these problems, and this real critical idea of sustainability, which is going to be a theme. It starts out actually with a case study, and it's called A Vision of a More Sustainable World in 2065. Kind of talks about a family that's living in the future, how we humans really need to adjust and transition our attitudes toward the environment and have a shift in behavior that can lead to a future of our planet in 2065 and even beyond. Right now, of course, we rely lots on fossil fuels. Well, making the transition to from non-renewable resources rather to renewable resources is essential because we're going to run out of those fossil fuels eventually. A part of this, we want clean air, we want clean water, all part of the sustainability idea. Sustainability is the capacity of the Earth's natural systems and human cultural systems to survive, flourish, and adapt into a very long-term future. Really simply put, we need to save for future generations, and we need to provide for a healthy, clean environment. So what are some principles of sustainability? Of course, nature has sustained us for billions of years. The planet is roughly 4.6 billion years old. We've been on the planet for a mere 200,000 years as is. We've really affected the planet. We need to go back to kind of a model of how nature acts and kind of following that model. Our lives and economies really depend on that energy and of course from the sun and on natural resources. Natural resources are things like water, fresh water particularly, ample food supply, the right nutrients, the right calories in our food supply, and other resources that we're going to talk about, shelter, and so on to us, and we need to sustain that for future generations. So the study of this environmental sciences really includes everything around us. Environmental science, the really neat thing about it is it's interdisciplinary science. It connects information and ideas from a lot of natural science things like ecology, food webs, food chains, biology, things like natural selection. Geology, we'll talk this year about plate tectonics, rocks, all that good stuff that goes along with the earth. Chemistry, a lot of environmental chemistry, particularly when we get into air pollutants and water pollutants. It even involves social sciences like geography. We'll talk about different regions of the planet, how they affect their environment. Politics comes into play, and of course economic pollutants that get into our air and into our water, how they react and what they do to our body systems. Social sciences are also interweaved. Things like geography, politics, economics, demographic studies rather is also in this. 3 principles of sustainability. We really rely on our solar energy. Of course, the sun really provides everything. Without it, our planet would not be warm, and we would not be able to have photosynthesis, which occurs, or gives us rather, those lovely things called oxygen and glucose. Biodiversity critical, you probably learned a lot about that in your biology class at one time, but we need variety and adaptability of different species on our planet. Chemical cycling from the environment to organisms and then back to the environment. You probably heard the saying before of you come from the earth and you return to the earth. Think about even a tree growing. It takes nutrients out of the ground, and then what happens is once that tree lives its life, it dies, of course, and it'll return those nutrients back to the ground. So kind of a cycle of life. We'll talk down the road about this nitrogen cycle, oxygen cycle, water cycle, sulfur cycle, carbon cycle, a bunch of different things. Environment, biodiversity is key. We need a wide variety of these species to help rely on for not only food resources, but things like aesthetics and different values. Sustainability does have certain key components that help keep us alive. We need natural capital. It keeps species alive. This includes 2 things, natural resources and natural services. Natural resources are useful materials and energy in nature. Things like food, water, shelter. How do we get shelter? We get it from wood products oftentimes, or we get it from rock structures to make cement. Natural services are important nature processes such as renewal of air, water, and soil, as I mentioned before. For example, the water cycle. We constantly rely on that water cycle to evaporate water into the atmosphere, and then that water falls back down, of course, and we get it as rain and precipitation. It waters our crops. We get more food out of it. Ecosystem services are processes provided by healthy ecosystems. It's important to maintain those healthy ecosystems. Other principles of sustainability that really come from social sciences, first of all, is full cost pricing of materials. We don't do that currently in the world. That includes harmful health and environmental costs of goods and services. So when you think about buying a new iPhone, for example, what happens is that iPhone came from the earth at one time. We needed to mine all the minerals, including the plastic, which is made out of, which is an oil product, and all the heavy metals that go into it. Then what happens is we use our iPhone, which is great, but then what happens is we need to dispose of it properly someday. Well, what's happening is we don't pay for that full cost. We kind of pay for that immediate product, but then when we get rid of it, what happens to it? We don't pay for that. If we did, our items would be much more expensive, but much better for the environment too. Win-win solutions benefit people and the environment, so we need to think that way. We want to sustain our environment, we want our nice products and everything, but kind of think about it more in a natural means. We need this responsibility to future generations. So once again, what are some principles of sustainability? Applying that full cost, committing to preserving Earth's life support systems for future generations, and it really combines three things: economics, ethics, how do we feel about these things, shifting our mindset over to more environmentally friendly ideas, and of course politics comes into play with this also. Or if we're in a recession, we need to balance what effects the Earth has. Resources, I've talked about them a little bit, but they're anything we obtain from the Earth to meet our needs. If you take a look at the picture to the right, on the bottom, air, water, trees, plants, soil, sun, wind. Not only that, but we need clean air, we need clean water, we need trees, we need to plant more trees when we cut trees down. Right now in the United States, for every tree that's commercially cut down, 2 have to be replanted, which is an excellent idea to maintain our tree populations. Some directly available for use, of course, things like sunlight. Not directly available are things like petroleum. We need to get that from the earth. Of course, we use petroleum for many, many different things, including our cars, including heating our houses, including making things like plastic. We have an inexhaustible resource, which is solar energy, which we need to tap into, and more. A couple of things we'll talk about are renewable versus unrenewable resources. Renewable resources are those that can take anywhere from several days to several hundred years to renew. Generally, within a lifetime, it'll renew itself. Trees are an example of this. We can cut down trees, but as long as we plant them to replace them, that's a renewable resource. Sustainable yield is the highest rate at which we can use a renewable resource without reducing the available supply. So we don't want to go cut down all our trees and not leave enough for future generations, because trees do take 30 to 40 years to grow really big ones. So we want to be about that. Non-renewable resources are things that have a finite stock on the earth. There's only so much. We get a lot of energy from these. Coal, for example, in the region that we live, a lot of our electricity is created by coal. Well, we only have so much coal, and it pollutes our environment, our air, and even our water quite a bit. Metallic mineral resources, things like aluminum and copper and gold and silver and platinum, again, there's only so much of that out there. Non-metallic minerals too, things like salts, even things that we put on the salts that we put on our road in the wintertime, for example, there's only so much of that too. So we've got to be smart enough. Developed versus less developed countries, currently about 17% of the world's population lives in developed nations. They are industrialized, they come with a high average income. If you take a look at the map, that includes, of course, the United States up into Canada, most of Europe, Australia is included in this, some of Southeast Asia also is included in this. Less developed nations, of course, hold 83% of the world's population, and unfortunately, oftentimes hold a percentage of poverty. So we are living unsustainably, unfortunately. We are degrading the environment quite a bit, something we'll talk about down the road. We're wasting, we're depleting, we're degrading the Earth's natural resources at too fast of a rate to replace. Think about, for example, as we remove coal and oil from the Earth, that takes millions of years to be created. Of course, we're removing it much faster than the time it allows to correct. Pollution, couple different sources. We'll hit this big time toward the end of the year. Couple of sources of pollution is point and non-point sources. Point is literally, if you can point at it and see where the pollution's coming from, you can see the smokestacks to the right. Boom, that's exactly where the pollution's coming from. Non-point sources, we don't know exactly where it's coming from. Maybe that river, a parking lot is a good example of this, a farm, several farm fields. You don't know exactly where pollution's coming from. Farm fields, we might be getting runoff that go into a local watershed. Well, we don't know where it's coming from. Maybe it's a big neighborhood, like in a community where you live in. Maybe one person in there is polluting, but we can't quite narrow down exactly where it is. That an important topic in this class is called Tragedy of the Commons. This was created first by a man named Garrett Hardin. And it's kind of looks at the types of resources we possess on the earth. There's open, accessible, renewable resources. There's shared resources, resources we share with other nations. The idea of the tragedy of the commons is when we have common property and open access to it, but they're degraded from overuse. This could range from, one example is whales in the ocean, or any fish in the ocean for that matter, but whales particularly. We only have so many whales left of particular species, and what happens if some nations kill them and eat them, what happens is it takes all the whales from everybody. Air pollution is an example too. Once air pollution gets up into the air, it can travel across international borders. What's happening is you are affecting the common air in this case. Fisheries. What happens is in populations of crabs, for example, which in Alaska, which is very heavily monitored, if one nation went in and overtook too many of the crabs, what's going to happen is it's going to reduce the number of crab that we have for the rest of the people in the world. Think about it on a smaller scale, even at school. What happens is a commons is kind of like our cafeteria. What if a group of students destroyed it? Well, that destroys a common. A very important concept for AP Environmental Science and just in general is this thing called ecological footprint. Ecological footprint is really the amount of land and water needed to supply a person or an area with renewable resources such as food and water. Basically, it's the amount of land needed to keep us living. And the thing is, because of our affluence in the United States and other nations have this too, our ecological footprint is quite huge. Per capita ecological footprint is the average ecological footprint of an individual in a given country or area. Again, nations that tend to be more developed tend to have larger ecological footprints. Ecological deficit is when a footprint is larger than the biological capacity, and that's what we're seeing with people, of course, that live in the United States, is we have such a huge ecological footprint. It's larger than the biological capacity. A biological capacity is the ability to make food and water and clean air, and if we surpass the ability to have food, for example, of course, our system is going to crash, and that's not good. Little picture here that just shows human footprint, and of course the ones that are most impacted, that use the most resources, are the ones that are in red, and you can see particularly in the United States east of the Mississippi River where most of the people live. Most of Europe and India, China, again because of their extreme populations, are affected, and some other regions that are green, of course, are like the Sahara, but of course the Sahara, there's nobody living there. A lot of Canada because there's not many people there. If you look at Russia, Russia has a total population of about 150 million, which is about half of the United States. Well, it's pretty green because they have a large population. A model that's real important is I equals P times A times T. I is environmental impact, which is equal to the population times affluence times technology. What this means is environmental impact is really variant on three different factors. If a population goes up, of course, we tend to use more resources to sustain that population. As affluence goes up, we have more things, if you will, and of course what happens is we need more resources to produce those fun things that we buy. Technology is kind of twofold because technology can actually increase the amount of food, for example. One of the thoughts behind GMOs is creating foods, more foods, quicker foods. Well, that's a technology that can increase it. However, technology, like computers, of course, take lots of resources to make. And of course, we go through lots of computers in our daily lives. They tend to stop working after a while, or we need to upgrade them so we get new ones. So we go through a lot of technology, so that's going to have a huge environmental impact. So kind of double one. Another case study is China's growing number of affluent consumers. Right now, China's population is at about 1.2 billion people. What's happening is their middle class is up and coming. With China's middle class up and coming, and of course they have the second largest economy in the world, they're using more materials. 2/3 of the most polluted cities are currently in China, and a lot of that is because they have so much traffic. As they have more money, they're buying more cars, which means they're driving more, which means they get more air pollution. And of course, they burn a lot of coal to produce that demand for electricity. Projection for next decade, of course, is they are going to be the largest consumer and producer of cars. They affect our environment. Going back a long time ago, humans, of course, started out as hunters and gatherers about 12,000 years ago. So we kind of moved where the food source was. Then we went through a couple cultural events that really started impacting how much we use our environment. The first one was the agricultural revolution, where we started planting one type of crop. That's called monoculture. Then we got into the industrial medical revolution, where we started burning lots of fossil fuels. You probably heard stories about England. Of course, you couldn't even see across the street because they were burning so much coal. Information globalization revolution is where we're at now. We can actually see the amount of rainforest that is being taken down with our satellite imagery. Absolutely amazing. We still have a current need for sustainable revolution. We need to sustain for futures, of course. Experts have identified several causes of environmental problems. The first one, of course, is population growth. As population goes up, we need more food. As we need more food, we need to put more pesticides down, herbicides down, fertilizers down, and of course that hits our groundwater and air pollutant also. We are wasteful, unfortunately. We live in an unsustainable resource use. Poverty is a bad thing. Of course, people that are in poverty not only don't have much money, but they also don't generally have access to as much clean water and clear air as those of us that are not poverty-ridden. Failure to include the harmful environmental costs of goods and services we talked about, and increasing isolation from nature, which is an interesting thing. As generations go on, we are seeing less and less kids particularly going outside, unlike generations before, because of the distractions of things like computers. Exponential growth, you can see that population growing. This is a J-shaped curve, a little dip in our population, as you can see on the chart. Black Death, of course, the plague. And then Industrial Revolution, what happened is our population took off. We had plenty of food, started getting into the medical revolution. People were healthier. We had more births than deaths, so our population is just skyrocketing. We don't know how much our planet can support. That's something called something we'll deal with down the road. Affluence, of course, having lots of money is harmful and can be beneficial to environment. Also, harmful environmental impact is we do consume a lot. We have high levels of pollutant. We need to create a lot of electricity, so we burn a lot of fossil fuels, particularly, and a lot of unnecessary waste of resources. Affluence can provide funding for developing technologies. So we do in the United States have nice clean air because we have things like scrubbers, which take those pollutants out of a factory before it reaches the air. So technology has really helped in that case. We've really tried to prevent environmental degradation. Again, we can see it with satellite imagery. And we're really trying to reduce waste. A big kick in the United States right now is to upgrade things like your washing machine and dryer at home and your furnace at home, and replacing putting new windows in your house, just to make it more efficient so we waste less. That's a way to sustain. Poverty, of course, as we talked about, has harmful environmental effects. Unable to fulfill basic needs. People that are in poverty don't have adequate food, water, shelter, health care, and education, and unfortunately they are just working to survive. Little quote on the picture down below: 1 of every 3 children younger than age 5 in less developed countries, including this starving in Bangladesh, suffers from severe malnutrition caused by lack of calories and protein. Prices of goods and services, of course, not included in harmful environmental cost. Companies do not pay the environmental costs of resource use. What you can see in this picture is deforestation. That's actually where they went through in the West Virginia and took a bunch of trees down. Of course, we use those trees for things like paper and to build houses. The thing is, those companies don't pay for the harmful effects that result from deforestation, such as a loss of habitat for animals, so we're losing a lot of animals with that. We're also increasing erosion rate, among many other things. Companies do receive tax breaks and subsidies to do things like this to keep prices artificially low and so we can build our houses. The reality is we're not paying for that environment at the end. We're increasing isolated from nature, as I mentioned before. What's happening is across the planet, we are living more and more in cities, not necessarily in the United States. And we're not going outside. We're not having enough contact with nature because we've got too many other distractions. Couple worldviews that are very important. First of all, planetary management worldview. We are separate from and in charge of nature. In other words, we control everything in nature. We should control it. Not really the kind of thought process that we're going to be after in this class. Stewardship worldview is a manage Earth for our benefit with ethical responsibility to be stewards, so quite a bit better than the planetary management worldview. Probably the best is the environmental wisdom worldview. We're part of nature and must engage in sustainable use. Little picture here, a good thing that's going on is ecotourism. This is aboard actually endangered Asian elephants in India in a national park, and they're actually learning about threatened species. There's lots of nations, including places like Costa Rica and Kenya, that have gone to ecotourism, which they're learning brings in a lot of money to those nations. Environmentally sustainable societies meets the current needs in a just and equitable manner without compromising future generations. So kind of the theme that we talked about within this chapter. We've got to rely more on renewable resources such as wind, water, solar. Kind of to wrap things up overall, to promote a more sustainable future, we need an overall attitude that combines environmental wisdom with compassion for all life, of course, a nice balance with nature. Social scientists suggest it only takes 5 to 10% of the population to bring about major social change. And significant social change can occur more quickly than we often think. The good news is, as we progress and generations continue on, we're learning more about our environment because of things like technology. So a lot of people are appreciating that environment and living in a much more sustainable manner. That's it for Chapter 1.